What are the common mistakes in construction tenders? A tender is a submission made by a prospective supplier in response to an invitation to tender. It makes an offer for the supply of goods or services. Tender documents are prepared to seek tenders, offers. The tendering process is the opportunity on the part of the bidder to demonstrate suitability for the project over the competitors. There are several common mistakes that can be made when tendering for construction projects which can harm the chances of the bid being successful. Too many packages. Ideally, tender documents should be broken down into a series of packages, each with its own design drawings and specifications suitable to be issued by the main contractor to potential subcontractors. It is important, when this is done, to ensure that the interfaces between packages are properly identified and clearly allocated to one package or another. Having too many packages increases the number of interfaces and so the potential problems. Inaccurate costings. It is typical for a pricing template to be completed, displaying all the expected costs, which makes it easier for those reviewing the tender bids to compare the various submissions. If this is incorrect, the final prices, and the rest of the estimate, may be discarded. Incorrect formatting. Tender bids can be penalized or disqualified if they do not conform with the specified formatting. Different types of tender may require specific documents to be submitted. They may also require multiple copies to be submitted or different formats, for example a version of the bid without pricing information, so that different members of the procurement team can review the bid. Therefore, it is important to be meticulous in checking that the tender meets the required formatting and number/type of copies. Missing information. Tender bids can also be penalized or disqualified if there is required information that is missing, that is, a question is left unanswered. It may be the case that the bidder is allowed to provide the information that is missing, although this cannot be guaranteed. Another common mistake is forgetting to sign all the necessary documents in the tender. Misunderstanding the specifications and client's requirements. The tender submission needs to demonstrate that the bidder understands the requirements and needs of the client and has considered them carefully in the development of their design. Therefore, submissions that are generic rather than bespoke and considered in terms of the specific client are unlikely to be successful. Failing to visit the site. Since every construction site is different, failing to visit it prior to submitting a tender can mean that the bidder does not have as comprehensive an understanding of the requirements of the project, the needs of the client, and the likely conditions that will need to be considered within the bid. This can also be a problem if the bid is successful and issues become apparent once work begins. Inaccurate evaluation of plant and equipment. When completing a bid, it is important that the tenderer ensures that they have access to the plant and equipment that will be necessary to complete the works. If the resources are owned by the tenderer, this will involve checking that they will be available at the time and for the duration required, and that they are all in good working condition and unlikely to require time and cost-intensive maintenance. Spelling and grammatical mistakes. A tender bid that contains spelling and grammatical mistakes, while not necessarily disqualifying the tenderer, may present the client with an unprofessional impression. To avoid this, documents should be carefully checked and proofread to correct any errors before sending to the client. Late submission. Failing to submit a tender by the stated deadline is likely to result in the bid being disqualified. Careful planning and time management should be employed by the tenderer to avoid having to rush to complete the bid on time, as this may result in more errors being made.